Cold air drifted through the abandoned drainage easement as a patrol officer's flashlight stopped on fabric stiff with frost, half hidden beneath reeds, placed where water should have carried it away, signaling that December silence had preserved something deliberate, waiting, and criminal beneath Houston's muted winter sky that morning alone forever. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. Houston in late December of 1979 was not built for cold, yet that winter pressed itself into the city with an unfamiliar restraint. Gray mornings lingered longer than usual, and the neighborhoods near Buffalo Bayou carried a quiet that felt out of place in a city defined by motion. The item recovered along the drainage channel was logged before sunrise, photographed, sealed, and transferred without ceremony. It belonged to a young woman who had vanished 3 weeks earlier, 22 years old, recently graduated, newly employed, and last seen leaving a modest apartment complex decorated with early Christmas lights. Her name appeared in police records as part of a missing person entry filed on December 10th, 2 days after she failed to arrive for a Sunday family dinner. The timing mattered. Thanksgiving had just passed. Christmas shopping crowds were building. Houston newspapers were already filled with seasonal advertisements and year-end reflections. Disappearances during holidays often blurred into travel assumptions and delayed reporting. This one did not. Her family insisted something was wrong from the beginning. Initial interviews established a narrow window. She left work on a Friday evening, December 7th, just after dark. Coworkers remembered her mentioning errands, nothing more. Her car remained parked at her apartment. There were no confirmed sightings after that moment. The first responding officers noted no signs of forced entry, no disturbance, no indication of flight. The apartment thermostat was set low, as if she expected to return. A wrapped Christmas gift sat untouched on the kitchen counter. The recovered fabric changed the classification of the case. It confirmed movement, relocation, and intent. The material matched a coat described in the missing person report. Fibers collected from the reeds were preserved, though forensic comparison methods of the time were limited. The location itself raised immediate questions. The drainage easement was not visible from the road and was rarely accessed in winter. Its selection suggested familiarity rather than chance. By the end of December, local press began referring to the case in cautious terms. There was no language of homicide yet, only concern and unanswered absence. The holidays passed with no progress. New Year's Eve coverage in the Houston Chronicle included a brief column noting unresolved cases entering 1980. Her name appeared between property crimes and traffic fatalities, a small paragraph competing with fireworks forecasts and civic optimism. The early investigation followed procedure. Detectives reconstructed her routine, her relationships, her financial records. There were no large withdrawals, no planned travel. Phone logs showed routine calls to family and a single unanswered message left on an answering machine that Saturday morning, likely from her mother. Friends described her as cautious, not prone to sudden decisions. No evidence suggested voluntary disappearance. Winter gave way to spring, and then to another Texas summer. Leads narrowed instead of expanded. A man seen in the apartment complex parking lot was interviewed and cleared. A coworker rumored to have shown interest was questioned and excluded by alibi. Each elimination reduced the field but offered no replacement suspect. Evidence remained static in property rooms and paper files. By Thanksgiving of 1980, the case was formally reclassified. Investigators acknowledged what had long been implicit. The young woman was presumed dead, though no remains had been recovered. Her family marked the holiday without resolution, setting an empty chair by tradition, a detail later noted in a human interest article that briefly revived public attention. The 1980s progressed and Houston expanded. Roads were widened. Neighborhoods changed. The drainage easement where the coat had been found was partially reworked during flood control improvements. The original evidence, boxed and labeled, was moved twice between facilities. Detectives retired or transferred. Notes were handwritten, some fading, some incomplete. The case entered what departments refer to as suspended animation. It was not forgotten entirely. Each December, usually near Christmas Eve, a short piece would appear in local media, listing unresolved cases from previous decades. The tone was restrained, almost ritualistic. There were no appeals for witnesses anymore, just acknowledgments of absence. In 2009, Houston Police Department initiated a cold case review program aligned with advances in forensic science. The initiative focused on cases with preserved physical evidence and clearly defined timelines. This case met both criteria. The coat, though degraded, had been stored under conditions considered acceptable for later testing. New methods allowed for DNA extraction from areas previously considered unsuitable. The review began quietly. There was no press release. Analysts digitized old reports, re-entered names into searchable databases, and reconstructed movements using modern mapping tools. One detail, overlooked in 1979, drew attention. The drainage easement was not random. It aligned with a utility access route used frequently in the late 70s by a specific category of contractors servicing nearby industrial properties. Investigators compiled a list of individuals employed in those roles during that period. Employment records, tax filings, and union rosters were cross-referenced. Many names led nowhere, deceased, or long relocated. One, however, remained local, though absent from Houston for decades. He had returned in 2008, retired, his address registered in a suburban development built long after the original investigation stalled. Surveillance and background checks revealed no recent criminal activity. He lived quietly, attended church, and volunteered during holiday food drives. There was nothing outwardly remarkable. What drew renewed scrutiny was not behavior but proximity and access. In 1979, he worked night shifts maintaining drainage infrastructure within blocks of the victim's apartment complex. A court order authorized discrete DNA collection using legally obtained material. Comparison with genetic material recovered from the coat produced a partial match. Statistical probability exceeded accepted thresholds when combined with mitochondrial analysis. It was not conclusive alone, but it was sufficient to proceed. Further investigation uncovered a pattern. In late 1979, shortly after the disappearance, the suspect had abruptly relocated out of state, citing family reasons. Records showed no such necessity. He returned to Texas only after retirement, nearly 30 years later, his past unexamined in a city that had largely moved on. This was the moment the case shifted from archival to active. Detectives re-interviewed aging witnesses. Some surprised the case still existed. Subtle inconsistencies emerged, not dramatic but cumulative. The suspect's statements from 1979, brief and unremarkable then, now conflicted with employment logs and route assignments. By December 2010, prosecutors believed the evidentiary chain met the standard required. An arrest warrant was issued quietly, executed without incident. The announcement came days before Christmas, 3 decades after the disappearance first disrupted a family holiday. The city took note, not with shock, but with a measured recognition of delayed accountability. The remainder of the story would unfold in courtrooms and records, not headlines. As Houston closed a chapter it had carried into winter for 31 years. The arrest did not arrive with spectacle. It appeared in the local paper as a narrow column beside holiday traffic advisories and charity listings, the kind of placement that spoke to restraint rather than triumph. For investigators, the work intensified rather than concluded. An arrest after 3 decades required reconstruction precise enough to withstand scrutiny shaped by time, memory erosion, and evolving forensic standards. The suspect's return to Houston had gone unnoticed by anyone connected to the original case. Retirement communities had grown across former pasture land, and his presence blended into routine suburban life. Records showed he purchased his home in cash, a detail noted but not overstated. Investigators focused instead on his movements during December 1979. Employment logs, once stored on microfilm, confirmed his assignment areas during the weeks surrounding the disappearance. One route overlapped repeatedly with the drainage easement where the coat was found. Re-examining the geography proved essential. Houston's layout in the late 70s differed from its modern sprawl. Fewer controlled access points existed, and certain utility corridors allowed movement unseen from main roads. Detectives walked those routes again, this time with digital overlays of historical aerial photographs. The alignment between the victim's apartment, the easement, and the suspect's work assignments was neither perfect nor coincidental. It suggested opportunity without requiring speculation. Autopsy findings were absent, a limitation acknowledged from the outset. Without recovered remains, the case relied on circumstantial evidence reinforced by forensic linkage. Prosecutors understood the challenge. They assembled a narrative grounded in routine, deviation, and concealment rather than dramatic acts. The emphasis remained on what could be proven, not what could be imagined. Laboratory analysts expanded testing on preserved items. Advances since the initial review allowed for secondary transfer analysis, assessing whether fibers and biological material indicated direct contact. Results suggested handling consistent with relocation of clothing rather than environmental exposure. Seasonal context mattered. December humidity and temperature patterns in Houston explained preservation anomalies that had once raised doubts. Witness interviews resumed cautiously. Many individuals had aged into their 70s. Some memories were fragmented, others sharpened by repetition over years of unanswered questions. Investigators corroborated statements only when supported by documentation. One former coworker recalled schedule changes during the week of the disappearance, a recollection verified by payroll records showing overtime approved for emergency drainage maintenance. The suspect's own account evolved subtly. In 1979, he reported routine work and an early departure for personal reasons. In later interviews, his recollection shifted to longer hours and altered routes. Each change was documented, not challenged theatrically, but measured against records. The accumulation of small discrepancies formed a pattern prosecutors considered significant. Media coverage increased as the case progressed toward trial. The tone remained subdued, shaped by Houston's long familiarity with unresolved cases and late answers. Articles emphasized procedural persistence rather than moral outrage. For older readers, many of whom remembered the original disappearance, the story carried a particular gravity. It intersected with their own recollections of holidays past, of news read decades earlier and then forgotten. Thanksgiving of 2011 approached with pretrial motions pending. The court calendar placed hearings between municipal closures and holiday recesses. Legal teams worked around seasonal schedules, a reminder that justice, like life, continued within ordinary constraints. The victim's family attended quietly, their presence noted without comment. The defense strategy centered on the absence of a body and the passage of time. Prosecutors anticipated this and focused on consistency. They presented a timeline that did not require leaps, only acceptance of opportunity and subsequent behavior. The suspect's abrupt relocation shortly after the disappearance featured prominently, contextualized within economic conditions that did not otherwise justify the move. Financial records revealed modest but telling details. A storage unit rented in early 1980 had been terminated abruptly. Its contents were unknown, but the timing aligned with the suspect's departure. Such elements were presented not as conclusions but as corroborative points within a broader framework. As the trial date approached, Houston entered another winter. Decorations appeared along streets that had not existed in 1979. The courthouse itself remained unchanged in many respects, its records rooms still cooled to preserve aging files. Clerks retrieved documents stamped with dates older than many attending jurors. Testimony unfolded methodically. Expert witnesses explained forensic principles without embellishment. Analysts described probabilities and limitations, careful to avoid overstating certainty. The absence of remains was addressed directly, framed as a result of concealment and environmental factors rather than investigative failure. The defense challenged reliability, emphasizing contamination risks and memory decay. Cross-examination highlighted gaps but struggled to dismantle the central alignment of evidence. Jurors were reminded repeatedly of their obligation to weigh reasonableness, not narrative completeness. Closing arguments concluded days before Christmas. The jury deliberated through the holiday weekend, sequestered from seasonal distractions. Their verdict arrived quietly, read in a courtroom filled with restrained anticipation. The finding acknowledged the weight of circumstantial evidence when assembled with discipline and corroboration. Sentencing occurred the following January. The court imposed a term reflecting the severity of the crime and the enduring harm caused by its concealment. There were no dramatic statements, only a formal acknowledgement of loss and accountability. The suspect was led away without incident. For the victim's family, closure arrived without celebration. They returned to private lives shaped by absence, now accompanied by resolution. The city recorded the case as solved, its file archived with annotations reflecting advances that made resolution possible. In subsequent years, the case became a reference point within the department, cited in training materials emphasizing evidence preservation and periodic review. Each December, when unresolved cases were listed, this one no longer appeared. Houston continued to grow, seasons cycling with familiar predictability. Somewhere beneath the routines of holidays and traffic, a lesson remained. Time did not erase responsibility. It only delayed recognition, waiting for the moment when persistence and method could finally align. The conviction did not conclude the examination of the past. It redirected it. Investigators completed supplemental reports to document how evidence survived decades of storage, transfer, and administrative reform. Each item was relabeled with contemporary identifiers, and chain of custody logs were reconciled to ensure no ambiguity remained for appellate review. The process mattered because the case would now be studied beyond Houston, cited by other departments facing similar dormant files. Court records showed that jurors relied heavily on routine details. The victim's age, 22 at the time of disappearance, placed her in a transitional phase familiar to many older readers: recent independence, steady employment, ordinary ambitions. Prosecutors avoided dramatization, focusing instead on calendars, pay stubs, utility routes, and weather logs. December rainfall data explained soil conditions near the easement. Temperature ranges clarified preservation timelines. Nothing required conjecture. The appellate window opened as expected. Defense counsel filed motions challenging forensic interpretations and alleging prejudicial delay. The court addressed each claim methodically, noting that delay resulted from the suspect's absence and limitations of available science, not negligence. Opinions cited precedent affirming that advances in testing can lawfully reopen dormant evidence when original preservation was adequate. The conviction stood. Public reaction remained measured. Letters to editors reflected relief more than anger. Many writers identified themselves as long-time residents who remembered the missing person notices taped to grocery store windows during Christmas shopping weeks decades earlier. The tone was reflective, acknowledging that resolution arrived late but intact. There was little appetite for spectacle. Within the department, analysts revisited the original investigative steps to identify where momentum had slowed. Staffing shortages in the early 80s, combined with manual record-keeping, were cited as factors. None altered the outcome, but the review informed policy changes emphasizing periodic audits of unsolved cases. Evidence rooms adopted standardized climate controls modeled on those used in this case. The drainage easement itself became a point of quiet reflection rather than memorialization. No marker was installed. Flood control improvements had altered the landscape, and officials chose not to disrupt current use. Maps in the case file preserved the original coordinates, now overlaid with modern infrastructure. The location's anonymity underscored the case's central lesson. Ordinary places can conceal extraordinary acts without announcing them. For the victim's family, administrative processes continued after sentencing. Death certification required judicial findings in the absence of remains. The court issued a declaration based on the conviction and evidentiary record. This allowed the family to close legal matters long deferred, including estate issues frozen since 1979. The paperwork was routine, but its completion marked a boundary finally crossed. Holiday seasons took on a different texture. Thanksgiving dinners no longer carried the open question that had hovered for years. Christmas passed with acknowledgement rather than vigil. New Year's arrived without the customary unresolved hope that answers might appear. These changes were subtle, registered privately rather than publicly. The suspect's later years unfolded within the correctional system, unremarkable by design. Appeals exhausted, his file joined others documenting crimes solved long after commission. There were no further revelations, no additional victims identified, no broader conspiracy uncovered. The case resolved exactly as it presented, a single offense, concealed and eventually exposed through persistence. Academic reviews later examined the prosecution's reliance on fiber analysis combined with partial DNA. Journals noted the careful framing of probability and the avoidance of absolute claims. Training seminars highlighted the importance of employment records and route assignments in establishing opportunity. The case entered curricula not for novelty, but for restraint. Local press revisited the story on its 40th anniversary with a retrospective piece. Photographs showed the victim as she had been, dressed for winter, smiling without awareness of future attention. The article avoided speculation, summarizing the investigative arc and final judgment. Readers responded with comments emphasizing gratitude for resolution. As Houston continued expanding, the courthouse files remained constant. Digitization ensured redundancy. The original code, now preserved within updated archival materials, was designated as resolved evidence, retained for historical reference. Its presence reminded custodians why preservation standards mattered even when immediate utility seemed exhausted. For older audiences, particularly men who had watched decades of crime reporting evolve, The case resonated through its patience. It reflected a period when investigations relied on notebooks and maps, transitioning into an era of databases and genetic markers. The continuity bridged generational expectations about justice, responsibility, and time. The investigation's conclusion reinforced a principle often understated. Solving a case does not restore what was lost. It clarifies what occurred and assigns accountability within lawful bounds. The absence remains, but it is named rather than undefined. That distinction matters. Each winter, when cold fronts briefly settle over Houston and residents reach for coats rarely used, the memory of the case surfaces quietly within institutional memory. Not as a warning, but as an example of endurance. The city learned that answers could wait decades without vanishing entirely, provided records were kept, evidence respected, and questions revisited. The story closed without flourish. Files were stamped, appeals denied, and calendars turned. Thanksgiving, Christmas, and New Year continued their cycles. In that repetition, the case found its place. No longer unresolved, no longer speculative, but fixed within the city's history as a reminder that time tests truth, and sometimes yields it. Archival correspondence revealed the administrative language of earlier decades, careful and understated. Memos referenced holiday staffing rotations, patrol adjustments for Christmas Eve, and reduced courthouse hours around New Year. These ordinary constraints shaped investigative tempo without determining outcome. Recognizing them helped reviewers understand why certain leads paused rather than vanished. The local university's criminal justice program later invited investigators to discuss the case in a seminar focused on longitudinal accountability. Students examined photocopies of reports, noting the evolution of terminology and standards. The discussion emphasized humility, acknowledging uncertainty while maintaining rigor. The case illustrated that patience must be paired with method, not hope alone. For the neighborhood where the victim once lived, change was total. The apartment complex was renovated, renamed, and repopulated by residents unaware of earlier events. Leasing offices kept no record beyond standard turnover. This erasure was neither intentional nor negligent. It reflected urban renewal's constant replacement. The case persisted only in archives and memory. Family correspondence preserved within the file showed holiday cards returned unopened for years, addressed in careful script. These artifacts were cataloged after resolution, not as evidence, but as context. They reminded reviewers that investigations intersect with domestic rituals often invisible in reports. Their inclusion was respectful, not sentimental. The court's written opinion closing the case avoided flourish. It summarized findings, affirmed procedure, and ordered records sealed where appropriate to protect privacy. The language reflected restraint, signaling an end rather than a proclamation. Clerks entered the judgment, and the docket moved on. Within the broader landscape of cold casework, the Houston investigation became a benchmark for incremental progress. Departments adopted similar criteria for re-examination, preserved evidence, bounded timelines, and plausible opportunity. The emphasis discouraged speculative reopening and favored disciplined review. As years passed, the case receded from public conversation, resurfacing only in academic citations and departmental briefings. This quiet was appropriate. Resolution does not require perpetual retelling. It requires accuracy, accountability, and an end point that withstands time. For those who remembered 1979, the answer arrived as a steadying fact. It did not rewrite the past, but it corrected the record. In doing so, it allowed the city to carry the memory without the burden of uncertainty. That balance, achieved late, was nonetheless real. It also reshaped how holidays were discussed in briefings, not as sentimental markers, but as operational contexts affecting staffing, visibility, and public behavior. Winter schedules, reduced daylight, and routine travel patterns were incorporated into analytical models. These considerations, once informal, became standardized. The final administrative act closed the evidence ledger, assigning retention dates and access controls. Auditors confirmed compliance, and the case status was updated across databases. With that, the investigation entered history, complete and bounded. In Houston's collective memory, the story settled into a quiet certainty. It was neither legend nor cautionary tale. It was a record of work done, delayed but finished, proving that careful preservation and methodical review can bridge decades and deliver lawful conclusions when time finally allows. That allowance did not absolve harm or return what was taken. It offered a defined ending, supported by records rather than emotion. For a city accustomed to growth and forgetting, the case affirmed the value of keeping what seems ordinary. Files, fabrics, schedules, and maps endured. When revisited with care, they spoke clearly enough. The investigation ended where it began, in documentation and restraint. There were no final revelations, only verified conclusions. With calendars turning and seasons repeating, Houston carried forward a resolved truth. The case remained solved, not because time healed it, but because persistence, preserved evidence, and lawful process eventually aligned. That alignment closed a long winter chapter, leaving records intact, questions answered, and a city able to remember without uncertainty as years continued to pass. Time moved on with truth secured. At last, the final phase of the case unfolded away from public attention, inside record rooms and quiet offices where conclusions are confirmed rather than announced. After sentencing, prosecutors completed mandatory reviews ensuring that every evidentiary element introduced at trial remained accessible and intact. Each document, photograph, and laboratory report was indexed again, not for discovery, but for permanence. The purpose was simple: to ensure that the outcome would endure long after those directly involved had moved on. For the victim's family, the conclusion arrived without ceremony. There was no press conference, no anniversary statement, no symbolic gesture from the city. They received certified copies of the judgment and the court's declaration of death. Those documents carried legal weight but little emotional language. They closed accounts that had remained unresolved since the winter of 1979, including tax records, property matters, and insurance files that had been suspended in uncertainty for decades. The family declined interviews. Their absence from media coverage was consistent with their conduct throughout the investigation. From the beginning, they had pressed for procedural diligence rather than attention. Detectives noted this restraint in internal summaries, recognizing that cooperation without spectacle had preserved the integrity of the case during its long dormancy. Within the Houston Police Department, the case became a reference example during end-of-year briefings. Supervisors highlighted how seasonal timing can obscure disappearances, particularly during Thanksgiving and Christmas, when travel explanations delay reporting. The lesson was not framed as criticism of earlier investigators, but as an acknowledgement of structural limits that had existed at the time. Evidence custodians documented how the preserved coat had survived multiple facility relocations without compromise. Its condition, once considered marginal, proved sufficient when combined with modern methods. That outcome influenced policy revisions, reinforcing the principle that evidence should be retained when uncertainty remains, regardless of immediate utility. The suspect's incarceration proceeded without incident. Correctional intake records noted his age, medical status, and absence of prior convictions. There were no mitigation hearings beyond those already concluded. His appeals exhausted within the expected time frame, and his name faded from public record searches, replaced by a case number referenced primarily in legal databases. For jurors, participation ended quietly. Post-trial interviews revealed no sense of drama, only a recognition that the case required patience and attention to detail. Several described the holidays as sharpening their awareness of time, noting how calendars had framed the evidence. Their service concluded with the knowledge that their decision rested on documentation rather than conjecture. Houston's local press returned to seasonal routines. Crime columns shifted focus to current events, and holiday editions resumed their emphasis on safety advisories and community gatherings. The solved case appeared only once more, in a brief follow-up confirming that appeals had been denied. After that, it receded fully from coverage. Academic reviewers continued to cite the case in discussions of delayed justice. Articles emphasized that resolution did not depend on a single breakthrough, but on cumulative verification. Each piece of evidence, insufficient alone, gained weight through alignment. The case was presented as an argument for sustained institutional memory. The physical landscape associated with the investigation remained unchanged in public perception. The drainage easement was not marked. The apartment complex bore no plaque. City officials concluded that memorialization was a family decision, not a municipal obligation. This choice aligned with the family's preference for privacy and closure without public symbolism. Holiday seasons passed with less weight. Thanksgiving dinners no longer carried the unresolved absence that had once defined them. Christmas mornings arrived without the quiet expectation of news. New Year's marked time forward rather than time waiting. These changes were incremental but real, reflecting how resolution alters memory rather than erasing it. In departmental archives, the case file was assigned a final classification code indicating closure by conviction. Access restrictions were applied to protect sensitive material, while non-confidential portions were retained for training and research. The balance ensured transparency without intrusion. The broader significance of the case lay not in its uniqueness, but in its ordinariness. It demonstrated how an unremarkable disappearance during a holiday season could remain unresolved for decades without extraordinary circumstances. There was no elaborate scheme, no series of offenses, no hidden network. There was opportunity, concealment, and time. For older residents of Houston, particularly those who remembered the winter of 1979, the resolution carried a subdued resonance. It aligned with their understanding of justice as something deliberate rather than immediate. Many had lived through periods when cases were solved slowly, if at all. The conclusion affirmed that patience, when paired with diligence, could still produce accountability. The court's final administrative order closed the docket. Clerks archived the file, and the digital record was updated to reflect finality. That action, routine in appearance, marked the end of formal inquiry. From that point forward, the case existed only as a resolved record. The absence of a body remained acknowledged but no longer defined the narrative. Legal findings established cause and responsibility without physical recovery, a reminder that certainty can emerge from methodical inference supported by evidence. This principle was reiterated in subsequent training materials. Seasonal patterns continued to influence policing strategies. Winter schedules accounted for reduced daylight and altered routines. Holiday staffing plans incorporated lessons from past cases, emphasizing visibility in transitional spaces. These adjustments were practical outcomes drawn quietly from long experience. As years passed, new investigators encountered the case only through summaries and citations. Its details were no longer active knowledge but preserved reference. This transition marked its true conclusion. A case ends not when attention peaks, but when it becomes stable history. The victim's name remained in records, now accompanied by a resolved status rather than an open question. That change mattered. It allowed memory to settle into fact, free from speculation. For her family, it meant carrying loss without uncertainty. For the city, it meant closing a chapter that had lingered through generations of change. Houston moved forward as it always had, through growth, redevelopment, and seasonal cycles. The courthouse continued its routines. Evidence rooms held countless items awaiting future review. The solved case occupied its shelf, complete and unremarkable in appearance. Time did not restore what was taken. It clarified what occurred and affirmed responsibility within lawful bounds. That distinction defined the resolution. There was no triumph, only completion. When December returned each year with its brief cold and familiar rituals, the story no longer hovered unresolved. It existed as a record of persistence, preserved evidence, and disciplined process. In that form, it required no retelling. It stood finished. The investigation that began in winter ended without flourish, grounded in documentation and restraint. Houston carried forward a resolved truth, secured not by urgency but by endurance. The case remained solved, and in that finality it found its place, allowing time to move on with certainty intact.